Hey, I'm Jessica Mudditt. I'm the founder of Hembury Books, and I am delighted to introduce Margaret Chipperfield, who is the author of No Buts, 12 Inspiring Stories from Men Who Change Their Violent or Abusive Behaviour. The book has just come out with Hembury Books. How are you feeling, Marg? Congratulations.
Nervous, excited, tired, lots of feelings. Yeah.
You had a terrific launch in Melbourne a couple of weeks ago, didn't
The
you?
launch went the launch went really well, I have to say. Four of the men actually stood up themselves and talked a little bit about their experiences, which was fantastic.
Yeah, terrific.
And it was well attended, so it was a very good launch, yes.
That's
I was
excellent.
very pleased.
Could you just give us an overview of No Buts, please, and how the idea came about?
Uh, yes, I started working many years ago with men who had been violent or abusive in a program known generally as Men's Behaviour Change Program. It's a 20-week program across the state. It's conducted across the state, which was great, a very good program. And then I was given the opportunity to start a support group or an ongoing group for people who'd done the 20 weeks and wanted to continue learning and growing and sustaining the changes that they started to make. And that was fantastic. I conducted that group along with co-facilitators, of course, for 3.5 years. And there was one guy that stayed the whole 3.5 years. There were others that stayed 3, 2, 1, 9 months. You know, they stayed. They were stayers, and they got a lot out of it. And it wasn't until a couple of years down the track, 2.5 years maybe down the track, that the men started saying things like, "Wish we'd done this much earlier in our life." Most men say that. Lots of men say that.
Mm.
And what can we do? How can we help encourage other men to change and to seek help? So the suggestion came that the stories be written, and that was agreed to, and 12 men wrote their stories. And their goal was to convince other men to make the sorts of changes they'd made.
Mm. And hence the cover design. I have the ebook. You have the paperback there, don't you? These are the
I do.
12 men who tell their stories anonymously, with the aim of helping other men to change their behaviour.
Yes.
Why is it called No Buts?
It's called No Buts because one of the men titled his story No Buts. And I thought it was such a beautiful title, because it's so apt. The whole group process is based on the fact that absolutely no excuses are acceptable. That you can't minimise it, you can't make an excuse in any way, you can't blame any other circumstance, any childhood baggage that you're carrying, you can't blame anyone who might have provoked you. You are responsible for your behaviour. And for some, that makes it much harder than for others, but that's the reality. We are all responsible for our own behaviour. So No Buts was the most appropriate name for the book.
Fantastic. What attracted you to a career in social work, and why did you return to it after retiring?
I guess what attracted me was several years as a single mum, in at which stage I started my studies and conducted my studies at Monash. And during that time, it's a tough life being a single mum
I hear you.
and of 3 kids on a pension.
Yeah.
And yet for me, I had so much support. You know, I had friends and family helping me with food. Someone did my typing for uni free. The postman fixed my lawnmower when he saw me cutting the grass with a pair of scissors. You know, people were really terrific. And I thought, how on earth are young women coping with this without the sort of support that I've got?
Yeah.
So I think that's what mostly prompted me to get into social work.
Wow. That's amazing. Okay. And then what prompted you to come out of retirement? Because you were a marriage celebrant for a number of years, weren't you?
Oh, I did that in retirement.
Yeah. Always
I
active.
was Yes, yes. I made a clear decision before I retired that I would leave myself open to whatever came along. I wouldn't go into retirement with concrete plans, and I didn't. But I did feel I needed to do something, and my work had been primarily in management, and particularly finished up in high management, which I wasn't suited to. Wasn't suited to bureaucratic work, and So I probably retired a little earlier than I'd originally anticipated, and decided that the men's program would be something I'd be really interested in working in, because I'd been there when it started. I'd been the manager at that agency when it had started, and I thought it was such a great idea. So I was keen to see how effective it was, and could I learn the skills to work with these men too. So I
Okay.
volunteered and started as a volunteer, and eventually ended up as a paid worker.
And how many years altogether have you been involved with the men's behaviour change program?
Well, I was involved for probably 12 or 13 years. I can't remember exactly.
Yeah, amazing. Okay. Could
It
you
wasn't full time. It wasn't
no,
as
but
I was working full time.
sure. Okay. What would a typical group session look like with the men that are featured in your book?
All right. In the long term group, which I'm primarily talking about, we had the men help us design the program. They took a lot of responsibility for the group itself in terms of helping to establish what sort of rules we'd go by, and what they needed to learn. And we would design the program, but it would be very flexible, so that if there was some learning coming up that we needed to follow through, we'd follow through with that, and let the design program wait until next week. And we would have a whiteboard where we parked ideas of things that we wanted to, or that the men wanted to follow up on. So a typical program would start with perhaps a few minutes of mindfulness, with the men just quietly doing breathing activities to help cut themselves off from their workday world and enter the group. Many men found that very, very useful. Some men didn't find it so useful, but they quietly sat there and
Tapping their feet.
yeah, that was fine. It was fine.
Yeah.
And then we would always do check-in. Check-in was a very, very important part of the process. And the check-in could take 5 minutes, or could take the whole 2 hours and derail whatever plans we had. Because check-in was about asking them in what their experience has been during the week. If they'd been angry, what level had it escalated it to out of, 1 to 10 grading. And we would then talk about what had happened for particular men, and they would tell their stories and the other men would respond. If the story was negative and that the other men felt there was a better way of responding or reacting to the anger that was building in the men, then they would tell their stories and their versions, or give their ideas. If the story was positive, which we always celebrated, it was really exciting. Everyone would be very pleased and would learn from it.
And that was about
So
differently to a situation that may have prompted anger. That it was those sort of positive stories.
yes, I'll give you one if you like.
Yeah.
One man was talking about when he was working on site and on a building site, and someone senior to him came up and rapped him over the knuckles about something rather unexpectedly, and he felt it was unjustified. And he's a big man, and normally he would sort of pull himself up to full height, and he could be, I imagine, because I never actually saw him do it, be very intimidating. And he didn't like being disrespected, as nobody does. But he remained silent. And then a couple of hours later, he went to lunch and he bought not one cup of coffee, but two. And he took one of them back to the guy that had reprimanded him. And the man looked at him and said, he just passed it to him and said, I think you probably had a tough day. And the guy said, oh, I can't believe you've done that. Thank you so much. And I'm terribly sorry the way I spoke to you before. And it was just a lovely story that was a change.
A change.
Okay,
so you check in with each other in the meeting, and then how would things go after that?
Well, the check-in could take a long time. If we got onto a subject that people were particularly interested in and needed to follow through, we'd follow through with that. Otherwise, after a break in the middle, we would go on with whatever we'd designed for the day or for the session, and we would do that until the end. And at the end, we would try and do something that would make people go away feeling okay, because sometimes the level of even despair was palpable, particularly if there were dads there who hadn't seen their children for a long time and were really grieving. So we would try and finish with a quote that gave them something to think about, and they would bring along quotes as well,
Mhm.
or something that would make them feel a bit better, some positive feedback amongst one another, so that they'd go away uplifted a little bit
Mm.
with plenty to think about and ready to come back next time.
Can you also explain for people about the men's behaviour change program? So the first part of the program that, you know, some men, they were mandated by courts to
Yes.
attend, and how
Yeah.
it kind of operates in Victoria?
Yeah, the 20-week program is a very good program. It's full of some very good content indeed. And the men who go into that are either men who go in voluntarily because they recognise that they need to change,
Mm.
voluntarily because they want to change for someone else's sake, or for some other reason, or because they don't want to go to prison, or mandated to go. Otherwise, prison would be an alternative. And some of those men would come along with, I don't belong here, it's got nothing to do with me, I haven't done anything wrong, it was her fault.
Yeah.
You'd find quite a lot of denial amongst a lot of the men. And so you have a mixed bunch to start with, and some of the men would be a little frightened, I guess is the word, a little apprehensive about what the rest of the men would be like. It wasn't going to be a group of men that, were threatening. And of course, we had very strict group rules, and the men were assessed before they came into the group as to their suitability. So the Men's Behaviour Change Program meets high standards and has excellent content.
Okay. And it was then after the completion of those 20 weeks that you had a group of men who said, I would like to keep going. This is helping.
No, I had one man come to me and said, Margaret, can you organise an ongoing support group? We had one some 20 years ago or something, which we had, but was never funded. And it took 18 months for the funding to be found to set up this group, and we did. So it was really started by one of the men who made me the suggestion, saying, would you get this going, Margaret? And me being given the responsibility to get it moving, along with other co-facilitators.
Fantastic.
So it was terrific.
It was driven by them and facilitated by yourself.
Yes.
Could you please share with us 2 or 3 of the men's stories to give us an idea about the change that they were able to achieve and the circumstances that brought them into the group?
Okay. Thinking. Yes, the stories were all so different. I'll try and give you 3 very different ones. I'll talk about Joe. Joe was very physically abused as a child and young man himself by his father. And he grew up bearing all of that grief and pain without an understanding at all of why he was treated that way. And he buried his feelings down deep, but he made a clear decision that as a father, he would never hit his children. And cut a long story short, he married and he had children. And I guess he could say he didn't know how to love them because his feelings were buried so deep that he unwittingly neglected them, and his wife. So the emotional abuse was quite significant. He isolated the family. He kept out anyone that would make any trouble at all. His wife's friends didn't like him. He kept the family away. He didn't in any way help raise the children. He didn't ever change the nappy. It was really primarily neglect. I think there was some control of expenditure, but it was primarily emotional neglect on a large scale. And I use that as an example to tell you about, because so often people believe that family violence is only physical, and yet it's the emotional that can have greater effects than anything at times. Certainly in my personal experience, I had bruises and whatnot, but it was the emotional that I was left with. That's what I carried forward into my future with me. So when Joe was issued with an intervention order to keep away from the family, he was absolutely gobsmacked. He had no idea think that anything he was doing would be considered violence or abuse. And he actually cried for the first time for many, many years, apparently. And he decided that either he had to go into a psych ward because there was something terribly wrong with him, or he had to go and get some help. And he looked up the men's behaviour change program and went along to that. And he was gobsmacked because he was still in denial. He didn't believe it was true, that he'd done anything wrong. He was gobsmacked when he saw the definition of family violence as it was shared on the first night with the men, as many of the men were. They're gobsmacked. They don't realise that the definition of family violence encompasses such a broad range of things.
Mm.
And the emotional abuse he knew nothing about.
Mm.
So it didn't take him as long as it takes many men. It took him about 3 weeks in the group to recognise that, in fact, what he'd done was abuse. And he took full responsibility for it.
Mm.
Unfortunately, his children are affected, or some of them are. And, of course, it's that cycle of violence that we're wanting to stop, the transgenerational effect.
The passing on of...
But his was a beautiful example of the point I want to make very strongly, and that is about, I'd call it ignorance, for want of a better word, of what family violence really constitutes, because both men and women have said they had no idea that this is what family violence is, and this is how it's defined by law.
Yeah, it's often a policeman
telling. Better off knowing.
Yeah. So in your experience, once the person gains the self-awareness,
yep,
how easy is the path to genuine change?
Oh, very hard. It's very hard. The first thing they have to do is put it out on the table and own it and take responsibility for it. And that's an extremely challenging thing for a man to do. It takes some men just a matter of weeks to do that, some men years.
Some never.
Some men can't do it.
Yeah.
Some men can't do it. Yeah. It's a big thing to do because the shame is so enormous. So the shame can be a motivating factor. I need to change. I'm really ashamed of myself. I need to change this behaviour. Or one that closes you off. I can't possibly bear to show this to anybody. I close it off, keep it tucked on underneath. So I've forgotten where we were up to.
Can you share another? We've heard Joe's story. Is there another story that you can tell?
Yes, there's another one about a guy who, with the aid of quite a lot of drinking, would become absolutely enraged and dangerously violent, to the point where the police were called. And he was able to, when he was told, because he wasn't totally aware of what he'd been doing when he was completely drunk, when he was told that, and when he recalled what he could recall, he was so aghast that he stopped drinking immediately and hasn't drunk since. And that was 4 or 5 years ago. But he did come along to group to learn other ways to deal with any pain or anger that he experienced. And he did learn. His wife actually, he went back to his wife and she actually wrote just a little summary of how he'd changed and how good the group had been for him. So that's another example. And another one is a guy who admits to severe emotional abuse, admits very, very clearly to severe emotional abuse. 2 of his children were suicidal. And he was asked by Child Protection to come along to the group. And one of the first things he did was say something negative about one of his family members on his very first night. And one of the other men sort of put his head up and said, "Hey, mate, we don't talk like that about our family here."
I love
the first guy quickly withdrew that comment and respected the confrontation that had just taken place, which was a wonderful example of how men have learned how to confront appropriately and how to tackle issues. So this guy who was new to the group changed a lot first by lowering his voice at home and then by changing his whole attitude. And one of the things that helped him a great deal was learning about empathy. And a lot of the men learned a lot through empathy because most of them didn't know what it was and hadn't experienced it either way.
Mm.
And once this guy had understood, and it took several sessions to get all the men to understand empathy, once he understood it, he used it in the group, and other men would use it in the group, and it was fantastic to see them using it with one another. And being able to better understand their partners and their children's responses and reactions and feelings to their own behaviours. So empathy was a great learner.
That's really wonderful. You must have a lot of empathy because as someone who has experienced domestic violence, to then work with the perpetrators must take a lot of empathy.
I guess so, but when you see them trying really, really hard to change, and it can be terribly painful, and I don't for 1 minute condone what they've done. Not for 1 minute. I know what it feels like to be on the receiving end of it, but to see them trying so hard, it's inspiring.
And you genuinely believe that this is bringing about behaviour change. So
I genuinely believe it's bringing about behaviour change, but I would not guarantee anything for any of those men or for you or I or anyone else. I wouldn't guarantee that anyone would never be violent or abusive. So I've seen the changes. I have no doubt of the changes in my mind, and that's all that I need.
What would you say to people who, on the release of this book, they might say to you, well, funding should only go to the protection and support of women and children who have been affected by domestic violence, not funding these men's programs?
Yep. Yeah, I'd understand some people taking that approach. And they would normally be people that perhaps didn't believe that men could change. I guess to me, I'd compare it with, let's say, cancer. If someone got cancer, you want them to have the very best treatment possible and best support and care. However, far better that they don't get cancer in the first place. And so therefore money needs to go into the research and scientific research into trying to work out how to prevent cancer occurring in the first place. Now, for the sake of the next generation coming up, I think we should be doing exactly the same with men, women and children. We should be providing the best possible support services for women who have been affected, and we should be trying our hardest to find out what works, what is the best way to help men change. And we need to do that to the next generation.
We do, because the statistics are alarming. What are the current statistics in Australia of the prevalence of domestic violence?
Oh, the most recent was 1 in 6, I think, but I'd have to look back up again.
Women, yeah.
Depends which one you read, yes.
Yeah, it's terrible.
It's an epidemic virtually, and it needs addressing. And we need to protect our next generation.
Yeah, if we're only sort of yes, locking up perpetrators is one part of what needs to happen, but it's not the complete correct response. It needs to be a holistic response.
Well, I guess what people don't realise, that there's a bunch of men out there walking around with a gut full of shame in their tummies. Not letting on to anybody, but that's what they feel, a gut full of shame, a feeling of really dislike for themselves, feeling a really poor self-esteem, but with no understanding that they can change or how or where to go to change. And we need to be encouraging them to use that shame to motivate them.
Why was it important for you for us to hear from the men themselves? I mean, this is, first in your book, it is a collection of your introduction and your insights, but also the first person stories of the 12 men and sometimes their partners, former partners. Why did you want to give us actually the men's stories, not paraphrasing or anything?
Well, who else could convince other men? Who else knows what worked for them except themselves? They're the only people that know that what works to help them change. And so we need to be hearing from them. I'd like to see a men's movement. I think there already are some. But I'd like to see men far more involved in designing the training, men who have actually been through it. Okay? Some of these men looking at what do we need to do next, what worked for me, what can we build into further training, and what can we build into schools.
So you went to each of their homes, didn't you? Sat down with them and talked to their families and did the interview?
No. Some of the men wrote their stories and sent them to me. Others I met in a cafe or in their home or my home. And in some cases I met family members. In most cases I didn't. That was entirely up to the men. So it varied depending on the need.
And then you sent their stories back to them so that they could check that everything was
absolutely. Yes.
Yeah, it's wonderful. It's wonderful. And as you said, 4 of the men attended the launch, and their identities are not disclosed, but they are happy to speak to the media about, in that confidential way, about their experiences, which is really
some of them are, yes, not all of them.
Not all
some of them are, yes.
Are you confident that the men featured in your book will sustain the changes that they've made?
I'm as confident as I can be, but as I said before, no guarantees. I don't guarantee anyone.
Yeah. Okay.
Not being abusive or violent.
What would you say to people who say that there's no evidence to suggest that change has taken place in the men?
Look, they're correct. Taking an academic or scientific point of view, there is no evidence of that nature to suggest that the change has taken place. This is a book about lived experience, and my feeling is that if a man reads one of those stories and something resonates in him and he recognises something in himself, then that's sufficient. It's worked. They're not going to say, oh, I don't think this has been clinically researched. I don't think they're going to take that approach. They're going to either recognise themselves in it and learn something from it, or they're not.
Could you tell us about a couple of concepts or strategies that really helped the men to achieve behaviour change?
Okay, the first and most obvious one is they've got to feel safe. The men come into the group and they know that their behaviour is not okay. That is a known, that is a given. Beyond that, there is no further judgment. They've got to feel they can be trusted and that they can trust the people around them, the facilitators and the other men. So there's a high level of trust developed. There is one rule that they know, that should the facilitators be concerned that they or anyone else is at risk, then the facilitators will go to the police. Okay? So that confidentiality will be breached under certain circumstances. But this group, the trust level was really, really high. They became like what one of them termed a brotherhood in the nicest sense, the sense of high level of trust and comradeship and honesty.
What do you hope will be the outcome of publishing No Buts?
I guess there's 4 things I'd like. Certainly would like to think that any men reading it are motivated to seek help. That will encourage men to seek help. Secondly, that men, women and young people will gain a greater insight into the whole concept of family violence. I think with this epidemic of family violence at present, we're trying to challenge it and do something about it, but we don't even have a collective shared understanding of what family violence constitutes. So we really need to be working on doing that. And I think by reading the book, people will gain a better understanding of what it is. And for women, I think that will help them make choices and decisions that are best suited to them if they have a better understanding, because they're not ignorant of the fact that what's happening to me is family violence. Many women are ignorant to start with because they don't know that. I didn't know that, apart from physical. Hopefully a greater awareness will help decision-making by both men and women. I'd like to see much more funding for long-term programs. I think long-term programs can make a substantially deeper and more sustainable change occur. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, I'd like to see us get into schools. I'd love to get into a school with teenagers and talk to them about what does the law say about family violence. Let's face it, when they turn 16, 17, 18, they go to a lot of trouble to learn what the law says about driving a car. And why is that? Because nobody wants to see them hurt anyone else or hurt themselves. And I think we should apply the same sort of principle to family violence. Let's teach young women and young men what family violence is. How do you recognise it? What do you do about it? And let the next generation grow up without the ignorance that so many of this generation has experienced. You know, I talked to a woman the other day who said to me, she said, for 3 years I thought there was something wrong with me. She said, and then I discovered, no, it wasn't me at all. And she said it was such a relief.
Yeah.
And women shouldn't have to experience that. We should be teaching them this is what family violence does and is, and this is when you need to seek help or get out or get away. And to the men, when you do this, that is considered family violence.
Yeah,
you need to change that behaviour. Yes.
Absolutely. I completely agree. It's also interesting, not all of the men that you feature have sort of dysfunctional family backgrounds. You know, there's one man who did not grow up experiencing family violence.
That's right.
So it shows the breadth.
Yes, you did right. And people grow up with all sorts of obstacles in their lives. And that comes across clearly in the stories.
Yeah, it does.
That some people have greater obstacles to overcome, like the guy with ADHD. And his wonderful description to me that having ADHD is a bit like trying to travel around Australia with a map of France. And I thought, yes, I didn't realise that was the sort of experience these people had. So that I learned a lot from him. But he didn't use it as an excuse. It wasn't an excuse. It couldn't be an excuse for his behaviour. It was never accepted. So some people have bigger challenges to conquer than others.
Yeah. Well, congratulations, Marg. You have been a pleasure to work with, and you've worked so hard on this book, and I'm really proud to be part of getting No Butts into the world.
Thank you.
If anyone would like further information, they can go to your website, www.nobutsthebook, and the book is available at all online retailers, and it can be ordered from any bookstore as well. So thanks a lot for talking to us, Marg.
Thanks, Jess.